Well, to help us unpack what to expect in tomorrow's midterm budget policy statement is Xhanti Payi, Economist and Head of Research at NASA's Advisory and Research. Xhanti, a very good afternoon to you. Nice to have you on the show. So this year's medium-term budget policy framework comes under the newly formed Government of National Unity. As we get your expectations about tomorrow and what to expect, where is the 7th administration likely to focus and allocate spending? I mean, predictions are already skewed on a push for greater fiscal discipline.
Good afternoon. First, let me just correct you there. I'm economist with PwC, South Africa at the moment. So that's just one correction. But I think it's important. I think your clip captures much of the thinking around where we are. You'll remember that one of the key issues has been the network services. So we talk about electricity, we talk about logistics, and those results have not really shown up. Even though we've seen improvements, we haven't seen that in the numbers for growth that have been released so far. And we're hoping to see that tracking upwards, but that hasn't shown. And in our perspective at PwC, we still see under current collections for taxes that we still have about a 25 to 35 billion rand shortfall that is still out there. And I think one of the key things that have just emerged from your clip also is what we might expect, which is difficult to tell, some of the tax revenue that would have come out of the two-pot system. So certainly, we're still at a place where we're looking at the growth that we needed to be able to make the collections that we needed, and that still probably has not yet shown up. But in terms of collections, we have still under-collected at this point in time. And one would have to look at the rest of the year, of the financial year, which would be from now until the end of March next year, and that might tell us something about where we are going to look like. But as things stand, we are still sort of hopeful that we are going to achieve targets as anticipated at the beginning of the year.
There's also a lot of expectation in this budget, Basic Education Minister not too long ago, Sipiwe Gwagube, appealing to government to prioritize the budget and resourcing of the department, especially in as far as the teachers are concerned. Even though this midterm budget does come during a favorable macroeconomic background, as we've said in our introduction, South Africa's debt is elevated to 75% of GDP. So who's likely not to be happy then here?
I think a lot of people are going to be unhappy. We think that the difficulty is continued because the main target at the moment is really to try and contain that high debt, because as you know, we have very, very expensive debt payments. Something the minister has said, we pay over R1 billion a month on servicing debt. And so that debt has to be managed down in the context of a growing economy. And so actually, putting more pressures in terms of spending is going to be a very difficult thing to do, unless there are real adjustments in certain parts of the economy of government spending. And that's really something that's quite difficult. And of course, we also received yesterday or the day before, the Treasury released some updates in terms of how we've been doing with FATF. That's the grey listing that we've been there. And it looks that outlook is positive. So the momentum to try and keep those reforms, to lower the debt, to make sure that we are managing our spending, to make sure that we are doing the right things in terms of FATF, are all ingredients towards actually better economic outlook and government spending and government finances. So one anticipates that one is not going to see a lot of increases in spending, but rather managing this down. I also understood from the clip that you shared them that there are still concerns about the public sector wage bill. And that requires, of course, management in across all areas of government. So unless there's some clear restructuring in terms of the current spending, in order to support education or to support those areas where you need it, including municipalities, it's going to be very difficult to introduce new spending or new money, but rather to try and see where you can run the restructure from areas where are not performing in terms of the allocations that they've seen in the current year and in the years to come.
Yeah, I want to squeeze in two more questions. Of course, you talked about the public wage bill. Something that we might not necessarily see a lot of in this budget is around, of course, social relief of distress grant. We saw that, of course, in the medium-term budget in 2023, but context obviously plays a key role here. So how much is he going to focus, given the fact, of course, we still have a lot of South Africans still living below that poverty line and suffering? How likely is he going to feature the social relief of distress grant particularly?
Yes, look, I think there's been some interesting things that have been going on in that front. Firstly, has been some auditing in terms of who has actually been receiving the grants. A lot of leakages, clearly, a lot of misadministration has also been emerging in that space. So one has to actually audit it and see whether or not there is space to actually accommodate more people in lieu of all of the other people that have been on that list and have been receiving these grants in a manner they should not have been receiving. So there's probably some space to do that. But of course, there was an indication at the beginning of the year that this had to be considered and looked at in the context of the bigger basic income grant as time goes by. But certainly at the moment, there is, of course, also the possibility of how do you invest this in a manner that actually also incites growth. So there isn't a possibility where you're actually going to expand this. But again, the point is to see where you can restructure it, where you can make it more effective. But we know at the beginning of the year, there was that increase. So there will be some indication as to how do you move on from this in the coming year. Remember, this is the mini budget. It just evaluates how far we've come and what are the possibilities from where we are now to looking ahead. And so the more messages you're going to get here are more of an evaluation of where we've been and how we actually then move forward to be able to evaluate and then to restructure some of the spending. So one does not expect that we are going to see increases there, but some indication about how this program is performing since the increases we saw at the beginning of the year and what changes we might see. But as I say, there's been a lot of emerging data around how it has been performing and some of the misadministration that has occurred in that sense.
Yeah, it may not be a midterm budget question per se, but how are we looking on the foreign investor front? I mean, pre-May elections, the ANC's potential loss of its majority raised concerns about possible political instability and hence the budget stability. Just yesterday, South Africa was wooing investors in New York at the SA Investment Conference with markets and investors watching. Is South Africa ready and stable for business as proclaimed by President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday?
There's no doubt that, at least here domestically, so local investors themselves, which are actually very close to the situation, have really been quite positive. So we've seen business confidence increasing in a reasonable way. We've seen consumer confidence. So certainly here at home, there has been a very positive impetus in terms of how the government of national unity has come and the restructuring. So at least at home, it's of course much more difficult, and I think that's why you are referring to this roadshow in the US, in New York, that has taken a lot of South African businesses to go and tell the story. Because remember, while we are very aware of what's happening and local investors are very aware of what's going on, it's not the same as international investors. You know, much of the good news we receive here at home do not reach actually our international peers. It's very much the negative news that reaches them. So what happens is that internationally they receive the bad news, but the good news don't filter as much. And so it's important that South African businesses, South African government goes outside of the borders to tell those stories. And this is just one of those areas where they have now to tell the stories, to tell the positive stories that have happened in the past year, including energy, including logistics, including new areas of governance and other areas like that we have just mentioned. So that is something that is still yet to come because international investors are yet to see that. So what we've seen now has been by and large responses from local investors.
Xhanti, a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time. Xhanti Payi, economist there and senior manager at PwC.